Welcome to the Dream Novel channel. Before starting to listen to the fun in this clip, don't forget to like and comment, so that the admin will have the encouragement to continue making clips. Let's go listen. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 141, Cedric, you ruthless merchant. Ron's small outburst seemed to go unnoticed as the girl continued on. I remember you, Ronald Weasley. Your mother helped me find the platform. Yes, but most people just call me Ron, he muttered. Okay, Ron. I'm Hermione Granger, she said, giving him a brisk nod before turning her attention to the other boy. And you are? Harry Potter, Harry replied. At the name, Hermione's eyes widened, and she quickly rattled off a list of reference books, proving she knew quite a bit about him. This left Harry feeling a bit dazed, considering he didn't know much about his own story himself, and he certainly hadn't read any of the books she mentioned. You really don't know? Hermione said with surprise. If it were me, I'd have found every book that mentions me. Then, looking back at Ron, she asked, Oh, and did you say that Kyle is first in his year? Yes, Ron nodded reluctantly. No wonder he was recognized by the Order of Merlin, Hermione said, sounding impressed. I hope I'm not too far behind him. I've already memorized all our textbooks, so that should help. Ron's expression soured further. This girl was starting to remind him too much of Percy, with her eager tone and relentless talk of studying. But Hermione, oblivious, continued. By the way, do you know which house Kyle's in? Is it Gryffindor? I've been asking around, and everyone says that's the best. But if he's that smart, he might be in Ravenclaw. Neither, Ron replied, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. Kyle's a Hufflepuff. Hufflepuff. Hermione's brow furrowed. But I heard that Hufflepuff's full of, well, students who aren't exactly the best at academics. That's not true, Ron replied, enjoying her surprise. Besides Kyle, there's also Cedric Diggory, who's top of his year, and he's a Hufflepuff too. Hermione looked slightly offended, as if she'd been misled. How could the top students from 2 different years be in Hufflepuff, of all places? If they were the dull ones, what did that say about everyone else? Next to her, Harry was feeling a bit down. When he'd first talked to Ron about the houses, he'd considered Hufflepuff a fallback choice. But if Hufflepuff was home to the top students, well, it seemed less like an easy house after all. Being first in the year. He could hardly imagine himself achieving that. Hermione seemed lost in thought as well, so Ron took the chance to ask, So, is there anything else you wanted to ask us? If not, we'd like to get back to our compartment. Yes, actually, Hermione said, snapping back to attention. I wanted to ask if you'd seen a toad. Neville's lost his. A toad? Ron sighed. We already told him we haven't seen it. Neville had just been by earlier, nearly in tears over the lost toad, and it had left an impression on Ron. Harry chimed in, maybe Kyle could help find it. That's a good idea, Hermione agreed, casting them a final, assessing look. But you two should hurry and change into your robes. We'll probably be arriving soon. With that, she turned and left. I really hope we don't end up in the same house as her, Ron muttered, shutting the compartment door behind him with a scowl. Gryffindor's got enough Percys already. Harry gave a distracted nod, still processing the whirlwind of information he'd absorbed in the last few minutes. Meanwhile, Hermione made her way to Kyle's compartment. Through the glass, she saw him gesturing with his wand over a piece of parchment. Her hand, raised to knock, froze. She remembered how Malfoy's abrupt knock had disrupted Kyle's work, leading to that entire confrontation. She certainly didn't have the money to pay for ruined maps. 200 galleons was unfathomable, let alone 20. Reluctantly, she decided to check another carriage. Inside the compartment, Kyle lowered his wand once Hermione had gone. Malfoy's family crest is ridiculously intricate, Kyle said, rubbing his eyes. Snakes, dragons, why couldn't they just settle for a simple M? Hey, Patience with our esteemed guest, Fred joked. Nothing easier than tweaking a design to pocket an extra galleon, right? You're not wrong, Kyle agreed, sliding the half-completed parchment over to Cedric to finish the map manually. Since it was a permanent commission, he couldn't rely on the doubling charm. Then Kyle pulled out the bag Malfoy had handed over. 150 galleons. So, do we split this now or wait until he sends the rest? The others exchanged glances and shook their heads in unison. Look, Kyle, George said seriously, you earned this through, well, your remarkable talents. It doesn't involve us, so no need to split it. Remarkable talents? Kyle shrugged. I'm no Ravenclaw. Besides, this is money from selling the map, so we split it equally. This was hardly the usual sale, though, Cedric pointed out. From Malfoy's door smashing to the entire negotiation, you handled all of it on your own. We didn't lift a finger. Cedric's words echoed the others' thoughts, they each declined to touch the bag. Finally, after Kyle's insistent urging, they agreed to take just 10 galleons apiece. George ended up with 15, the extra 5 compensating him for his defaced robe, which he accepted with no complaint. By the way, Cedric said, gesturing toward the damaged maps on the table, should we use the mending charm to fix these up? Huh? Why would we do that? Kyle asked, raising an eyebrow. Cedric blinked, looking puzzled. I mean, they're made from pricey galleon parchment. We can't just throw them out. Kyle narrowed his eyes, his tone skeptical. You're not planning on restoring them and selling them again, are you? Not exactly, Cedric replied, though he looked sheepish. Kyle sighed, eyeing him with mock disdain. Keep that up, and you'll end up in Azkaban for cunning business practices, mark my words. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 142, Throwing Galleons Away. As soon as Kyle finished speaking, everyone in the compartment turned to Cedric with amused, suspicious expressions. Fred, sitting beside him, slid away theatrically and said in an exaggerated tone, well, Cedric, I didn't expect it, you, of all people, with those bushy eyebrows and big, innocent eyes, actually thinking like this. Fred, who had been entertaining the same idea as Cedric, couldn't resist the chance to add fuel to the fire. After all, long train rides called for some fun, and it was always better when the laughs came at someone else's expense. Oh, stop that, it's not like that. Cedric protested, squirming uncomfortably as the others stared at him. I was just saying what you all were probably thinking too. Kyle's tone took on a teasing drawl. Fred, George, were you two thinking that? Absolutely not. Fred replied, with feigned indignation. George nodded, looking mock serious. I'm an upstanding businessman, I'd never dream of doing such a thing. Kanna, what about you? Kyle asked, turning to her. No way. Kanna said, shaking her head emphatically, her hair accessory nearly coming loose. And you, Cho? Kyle asked, keeping up the act. Cho quickly shook her head. No. I would never. See? No one else, Kyle said, raising an eyebrow. It's just you, Cedric, our unscrupulous merchant. Cedric's face turned red as he stared at his friends, feeling utterly betrayed. That's not true. That's not what happened, he thought, dismayed, as if his world had suddenly shifted. Give it up, you greedy merchant, Kyle teased, then handed the stack of damaged maps to Fred. When we arrive, you'll dispose of them in front of everyone. Fred took the stack solemnly, adopting the serious expression of someone accepting a high office, as though he'd just been appointed Minister of Magic. Make sure you do it before Hagrid arrives, Kyle reminded him. That way, the first years can witness it too. Fred, initially agreeing out of habit, suddenly sensed something amiss. Kyle's expression hadn't changed, he looked entirely serious. Wait a second. Fred hesitated, licking his lips nervously. Kyle, we were just kidding around with Cedric. Look, he's embarrassed enough. Kyle shook his head. No, I'm not joking. They have to be destroyed, every last one. Seeing the serious expression on Kyle's face, the laughter evaporated, and the others fell silent. George muttered, but, these are worth galleons. I know, Kyle replied, shrugging. But I've already committed, and if we don't want any trouble, we need to see it through. He continued, besides, the actual cost is minimal. Unicorn hair is easy enough to come by, and the fire crab fragments were just leftovers from a fight. Including the parchment, each one costs less than 2 galleons. Fred and George exchanged a look, barely containing their exasperation. Less than 2 galleons? They thought incredulously. Really? Can't we find another way? Cho asked, clearly uncomfortable with the waste. Maybe we could just transfigure ordinary parchment. But Kyle cut her off. No, it needs to be convincing. Just hearing my words won't convince everyone. Destroying these is the only way to make people genuinely value the 20 galleon maps. I get the logic, Fred said with a sigh, staring at the stack in his hands. But it still feels wrong to destroy something worth over 10 galleons. He felt like he was about to toss galleons to the wind, an unbearable thought after a childhood of scrimping. At that moment, Cedric, who'd been uncharacteristically silent, leaned over and looked directly at the maps in Fred's hands. If it's too hard for you, I'd be happy to handle it myself. No, I'll do it, Fred said quickly, clutching the maps protectively. Though he was struggling to accept the decision, he wasn't about to let someone else take over this peculiar and valuable task. In a few short minutes, the mood in the carriage had taken a complete shift. Everyone sat listlessly, lamenting the 10 galleons they'd be sacrificing. Only Cedric seemed immune, grinning as if he'd downed a bottle of elixir to induce euphoria. As evening settled in, the passing villages and fields gave way to mountains and forests. They were nearing their destination. After changing into their robes, Fred seemed to grow more and more anxious, rummaging through his suitcase as if searching for something to steady his nerves. At that moment, 2 new students knocked on their compartment door. It was Hermione, whom they'd met earlier, accompanied by a nervous-looking Neville. After listening to their request, Kyle asked, "So, you're asking me to help find your toad?" "Yes," Hermione replied earnestly. "We've searched the whole train, and it's nowhere to be found. Do you have any ideas?" "Not too difficult," Kyle said thoughtfully. "If you haven't left it on the platform, all it needs is a simple spell." With that, he raised his wand. "Accio Trevor." A croak sounded from a luggage rack down the hall, and in a flash, a toad soared into the compartment. "Trevor!" Neville exclaimed in relief, reaching out to catch his lost pet. "Neville, I'd suggest learning the summoning charm yourself," Kyle said with a smile. "That way, you won't have to worry about misplacing keys, books, or toads." Neville nodded, sniffling slightly. "Maybe, but I don't know if I can learn it. I'm not exactly the best student. I mess things up all the time." "Give yourself some credit," Kyle encouraged him. "You never know until you try, and I'd be glad to help." "And me too," Hermione chimed in. "Learning charms isn't too difficult. I even picked up a few over the summer." "Thank you," Neville mumbled, his face pale but relieved. Just then, the train came to a gradual stop. Fred took a deep breath, stepped around Hermione and Neville at the doorway, and announced with a determined expression, "All right, I'm off." "Don't dawdle," Kyle reminded him. "Make sure you're done before Hagrid takes the new students away." Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 143, The Ministry of Magic's Compensation. The train finally stopped at the Hogsmeade platform, and everyone spilled out onto the platform. Chaos reigned everywhere. Owls were hooting, cats were meowing, and toads were croaking in unison, creating a cacophony that filled the small space. Suddenly, a lion-shaped firework burst across the sky, capturing everyone's attention at once. Bang! Another firework soared up with a trailing plume of smoke. The young wizards quickly noticed Fred, who was at the center of it all, calmly setting off more fireworks. With everyone's eyes on him, he wrapped a parchment edged in gold around one of the fireworks and lit it. Bang! 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 Fireworks exploded one after another, forming lions, badgers, and dragons that leaped and swirled across the sky, holding their shapes for a surprisingly long time before fading. "Is this Hogwarts welcome ceremony?" one of the first years asked, clearly excited. Unaware of the actual reason behind the display, they assumed Hogwarts was putting on a grand show just to welcome them. And truthfully, the fireworks were mesmerizing. Watching the animal shapes sparkle overhead, many of them felt their nervousness begin to fade. But others had different reactions. "See, Zabini," Malfoy said with a smug smile to the other first years. "I told you Kyle would destroy the maps. You didn't believe me, huh?" He let out a mocking laugh, clearly pleased with himself. Next to him, a freckled boy stuck out his neck defiantly. "Who knows if that's true? Maybe it's just a transfiguration spell." "Absolutely not," Malfoy scoffed. "I trust Kyle. He won the special award for services to the school. He's definitely not that kind of person." "Who knows?" the freckled boy retorted, smirking. "Don't forget, all those students were second years. It'd be easy for them to pull something like this." The two of them were firm in their beliefs, each refusing to budge. Just then, Crabbe, the tallest of the group, noticed something fluttering down and reached out to grab a fragment of parchment. "Draco, look at this." Malfoy, momentarily distracted from arguing with Zabini, turned around. His eyes lit up as he took the fragment from Crabbe. "Aha!" He held up the parchment, pointing excitedly at the faint gold lines still visible. "Look at this, it's real gold. Do you still think it's just a transfiguration spell?" "Anne." He brought the fragment closer to his face, inhaling near a burnt spot on the paper. "I accidentally burned a hole in the unicorn's tail tapestry at home once, and it smelled exactly like this." Zabini's face flushed, as if he'd just been smacked. Seeing this, Malfoy became even more pleased with himself, his grin widening. "I get it, you probably can't afford the 20 galleons for the map. That's why you're making excuses. No worries, though. I asked around, and they have a few maps left for a Scrooge like you. You can always buy one of those." "Who are you calling Scrooge?" Zabini's temper flared. He could handle losing an argument, but Malfoy's mocking tone was too much. 20 galleons, did Malfoy think he couldn't afford that? Just who did Malfoy think he was? Just you wait. I'll buy the most expensive map they have. Zabini declared, sticking his neck out defiantly. "It'll be better than yours." "Tut tut, that's impossible," Malfoy replied with a smug look. "I'm buying the most expensive one, and Kyle promised my number would be at the front. So even if you get the same map, you'll still be behind me." "You, humph." Zabini fumed, glaring at Malfoy before turning on his heel and stomping off. Malfoy watched him go with a triumphant air, clearly relishing his victory. Just then, a light appeared above their heads. "First-year students. First years, come this way. Harry, are you all right?" Hagrid's towering figure emerged on the platform, calling out to the new students, just as he had the previous year. Meanwhile, Kyle and the other second years began walking in the opposite direction, heading toward the carriages that would take them up to Hogwarts. On the rough, muddy path, over 100 empty carriages stood waiting, each pulled by Thestrals, though only those who had seen death could see them. Kyle couldn't see them. He'd once come close. There'd been an incident with a werewolf at St. Mungo's, but the werewolf had been too resilient and had ultimately been saved by the healers. Half-death wasn't enough to see the Thestrals. Kyle approached a carriage, reaching out and feeling the bony, invisible head with his hands. The Thestral nudged him gently in return. Once they were seated, the Thestral pulled the carriage toward Hogwarts Castle. The interior had a faint musty scent, mingled with the dry smell of straw, reminiscent of an unused broom cupboard. The carriages rolled forward, passing through two grand wrought iron gates flanked by stone pillars, each topped with a winged warthog. The warthog wasn't a magical creature itself, but it was inspired by a dream of Rowena Ravenclaw, who had envisioned a flying warthog leading her to a clearing by the Black Lake, where she then saw Hogwarts Castle. Beyond the gates, the carriage picked up speed as it rolled along the road leading up to the castle. Through the windows, they could see the tall towers and turrets growing closer with each moment. At last, the carriage came to a slightly bumpy stop. The young wizards climbed out, still chatting excitedly about their journey, and made their way up the stone steps toward the castle's great oak doors. Torches flickered in the vast, dim foyer. To the right, the doors to the great hall stood open, waiting for the students to enter before the first years arrived. Kyle followed the flow of students into the hall. After 2 months away, he'd missed this place, and he cast a fond look at the enchanted ceiling, which mirrored the clear night sky, dotted with shining stars. Just as he was reaching the Hufflepuff table and about to sit down, he heard a voice call out, "Kyle, could you come here a minute?" Surprised, Kyle looked up to see Professor Sprout, the head of Hufflepuff, waving at him from the VIP section. "I'm coming, Professor," he replied quickly, weaving his way through the bustling crowd toward her. "What can I do for you, Professor?" he asked when he reached her. "The Ministry sent something here a while ago. They said it was compensation for the incident in the Forbidden Forest 2 months ago," Professor Sprout said with a warm smile. "I have a feeling it's meant for you." Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 144, The New Hogwarts wrap. Kyle and Professor Sprout walked through the foyer, up the marble staircase, and down a winding corridor. Professor Sprout's office was modest in size, filled with the earthy, sweet scent of soil. A warm fire crackled in the fireplace, and lush vines adorned the walls, giving the space a cozy, greenhouse-like atmosphere. Magical plants were scattered all around, making the room feel like a miniature version of the greenhouse outside. Near the window sat a small desk, and on it was a brown box. Professor Sprout pointed to it. "I received this package 2 days before the start of the school year. It came from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, along with a letter saying it was compensation for the damage done to the Forbidden Forest," she explained. Her expression grew a little strange. "But as far as I know, Minerva didn't request any such compensation, so I believe it's meant for you." "Ahem, yes, Professor," Kyle replied, a bit sheepishly. "I did write a letter to the Ministry of Magic, but only because the hit wizards asked me to. They knew I'd used some rare magical items in the Forbidden Forest, and that's how I managed to survive Orin. So, they generously decided to send some compensation." "Did they, now?" Professor Sprout remarked with a smile. "But the letter also said they'd soon be sending someone to construct a new greenhouse for Hogwarts. Did you request that as well?" No," Kyle answered after a brief pause. "I only mentioned that the excessive use of dark magic in the Forbidden Forest had destroyed many rare magical plants and trees that were centuries old. I guess that's their way of compensating the school." Professor Sprout's expression grew even more peculiar. She flushed slightly and looked out the window, knowing well what plants were actually in the Forbidden Forest. Most of the rare and precious ones had been moved to the greenhouse ages ago. What remained were mostly common species like Dittany and Puffapods. And as for the so-called ancient trees, after the hit wizards left, it had only taken her and Phileas 5 minutes to restore the forest to its former state with a simple general counterspell. Clearing her throat, Professor Sprout spoke with feigned outrage. "Yes, it's a shame about those plants. It's rare for the Ministry to consider these things and offer to build a new greenhouse for their protection." Looking quite pleased, she added briskly, "So, why don't you stay here and inventory their compensation to see if anything's missing? But don't take too long, I believe the sorting ceremony will start soon." With that, Professor Sprout left the office, closing the door behind her. Kyle approached the table and opened the box. Inside, he found a small collection of items, starting with a neat stack of 50 galleons labeled "Broom." He remembered throwing a broom into the forbidden forest during the encounter, but it had been destroyed when a tree fell on it during the battle. Unable to replace such an old model, the ministry had likely decided to compensate him with a monetary equivalent. Setting the galleons aside, they technically belonged to the school. After all, he turned his attention to the remaining items, the true focus of his interest. After removing the galleons, he uncovered 5 tightly sealed glass bottles. Each one held seeds of a different magical plant, with their names labeled on the bottles. Chomping cabbage mandrake lovage venomous tentacula fang geranium. Kyle picked up the bottles and carefully placed them into his moleskin pouch, feeling a sense of satisfaction. To make the compensation more plausible, he had listed these plants as lost items in his letter to the ministry. This was why they had sent him such dangerous species. Nearly all of them were classified as highly hazardous, especially the chomping cabbage and venomous tentacula, which were banned from private cultivation and trade. Kyle hadn't been sure how this would play out, but he had taken a gamble that the professor who received the package wouldn't look too closely at its contents. If she had, the seeds would likely have ended up in the new greenhouse instead of his pouch. Fortunately, luck had been on his side. Professor Sprout's primary concern was for the plants she already tended in the greenhouse. After gathering up the bottles, Kyle let out a long, relieved sigh. He couldn't help but feel grateful that the ministry had packaged everything so securely. Managing to get the seeds past a master botanist had certainly been an adventure. After leaving Professor Sprout's office, Kyle headed down the stairs and back into the Great Hall. The new students had already arrived, filling the hall with a sea of black hats and pointed ears. Every long table was packed with students, buzzing with excitement and anticipation. Up near the VIP section, the worn and tattered Sorting Hat sat prominently on its stool. This year, though, it sported some new accessories, a red and blue cloth wrapped around its brim, which might have been a tea towel or a bandana, and a pair of tiny sunglasses perched jauntily on top. Kyle entered the hall just in time to hear the Sorting Hat's song. The hat seemed more animated than ever, wriggling on its triangular stool as it sang in a lively, non-traditional tune. Hogwarts is truly a school where all taught magic is wonderful. Gryffindor has courage in their hearts and the bravery to face danger's arts. Hufflepuff is honest and hardworking, their students are tough and ever learning. Ravenclaw is clever and wise, seeking secrets where knowledge lies. And maybe you'll end up in Slytherin, calm, meticulous, they strive to win. Come on, take me with you. Don't be afraid. And last but not least, my name's the Sorting Hat. Where you'll be sorted. Don't you dare. The Sorting Hat finished with a flourish, and the hall instantly burst into applause, the cheers so thunderous it seemed they might lift the ceiling. Kyle smiled, then made his way over to the Hufflepuff table. Cedric had saved him a spot right between him and Mikkel. Kyle, if only you'd arrived a bit earlier, Cedric said with a touch of regret. The Sorting Hat's song was completely different from previous years. Well, I managed to catch a bit of it, Kyle replied with a grin. It seemed the Sorting Hat had received the Christmas present he'd sent it last year. He just hadn't expected Hogwarts to still be playing those tapes. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 145, Sorting. Once Kyle had settled into his seat, Professor McGonagall walked over to the triangular stool, and the cheers in the Great Hall gradually quieted down. She held up the Sorting Hat. When I call your name, you will put on the hat and sit on the stool to be sorted into your house, she announced. Hannah Abbott. A young girl with rosy cheeks and 2 golden braids stepped out of the line, stumbling a bit as she approached the stool. She put on the hat, and after a moment's pause, Hufflepuff. The Hufflepuff table erupted in applause, welcoming Hannah enthusiastically. Susan Bones, who had just been sorted into Hufflepuff as well, hurried over to sit beside her amid the cheers. The sorting continued in an orderly fashion. Hermione and Neville were both placed in Gryffindor, Malfoy was sorted into Slytherin just as he'd hoped, and Harry and Ron, unsurprisingly, joined Gryffindor as well. Kyle noticed Dumbledore seated at the head table, looking particularly pleased. Dumbledore clapped energetically and even picked up a cup, giving it a celebratory wave in Harry's direction. "This old bee," Kyle muttered to himself, feeling a mixture of amusement and irritation. He'd long suspected that Dumbledore would do whatever it took to support Harry, but such a blatant display was a bit much, wasn't it? In stark contrast, Professor Snape looked anything but pleased. Rather than glaring at Harry, however, he was eyeing the Sorting Hat intently, as though he might pull out a potion bottle and douse the tattered old hat at any moment. As soon as the last new student was sorted into Slytherin, Snape rose swiftly, ready to assist Professor McGonagall with returning the Sorting Hat. But she waved him off. "Thank you, Severus, but the list of new students needs to be placed in a designated spot, and I don't believe you'd know where to find it," she said, giving him a mildly perplexed look before rolling up the parchment and leaving with the Sorting Hat. Dumbledore then rose, his face alight with joy as he spread his arms toward the crowd. "Welcome," he called out warmly. "Welcome to Hogwarts and the start of a new school year. Before we begin the feast, I would like to say a few words." He paused, then declared, "Nitwit. Blubber. Oddment. Tweak. Thank you all." With that, Dumbledore sat down, and the empty plates before the students instantly filled with food. "Oh, I hate carrots," Mikkel muttered, staring down at the vegetable soup in front of him. He turned to Ryan, who was gnawing on a corn cob, and asked, "Wanna switch seats?" Ryan, who wasn't a picky eater, shrugged and got up to swap places with Mikkel. "Kyle, do you have any idea what the headmaster meant just now?" Cedric asked, frowning slightly. Dumbledore's words had sounded odd, almost as though he were an eccentric old wizard on the brink of losing his mind. Kyle thought for a moment. "Not really," he admitted. "But maybe he was making a comment about how each house views the others. Like how clever Ravenclaws might look down on everyone else, thinking they're all a bit slow, right?" "Oh, I see." Cedric nodded thoughtfully, piecing together the other words to fit the various houses. Kyle's interpretation seemed to make sense. Still, despite all the theories and interpretations, no one really knew what Dumbledore was thinking. The only person who might have had a clue was still locked away in Ermengarde. Everyone enjoyed their meal until the last crumbs of pumpkin pie vanished from the golden plates. With the feast over, Dumbledore rose once more. "Now that everyone has eaten their fill, I'd like to say a few words to you all," he began. "First, we have Professor Quirrell, whom many of you know, taking on the position of defense against the dark arts professor. And joining us as the new Muggle Studies professor is Professor Burbage." Two figures rose from the staff table, a man and a woman. Quirrell looked nervous and uncertain, while Professor Bubaji exuded a bright confidence. The hall broke into applause, though most of it was directed at Professor Burbage, who outshone Quirrell considerably. As for Quirrell, he barely drew a response, his yearly appearances were hardly worth a fuss. Nearby, an upperclassman muttered in disbelief, volunteering to be defense against the dark arts professor. "I never knew Professor Quirrell was so brave." As the applause settled, Dumbledore continued, "First years, please remember that the forest on the school grounds is off limits to all students. This rule is very important, and if anyone suggests going there, even if it's a professor you know well, do not agree." Kyle felt several pairs of eyes fall on him, making him wince. "Really? Am I getting a public shaming here?" Thankfully, Dumbledore didn't linger on this point for long. "Also, the caretaker, Mr. Filch, has asked me to remind everyone not to practice magic in the corridors between classes. And please do not bring any magical plants from the greenhouse back to the castle, especially the dangerous ones." Dumbledore's twinkling gaze settled on Kyle, whose mouth twitched slightly before he quickly composed himself. "All right, fine, headmaster," he thought, "no plants this semester. The Quidditch player review will be held in the second week of term. Anyone interested in joining a house team should contact Madame Hooch." Finally, Dumbledore's expression turned serious. "Lastly, I must tell you all that anyone who wishes to avoid a painful death should stay clear of the corridor on the right side of the fourth floor." Kyle snickered quietly. The bait was so obvious it was practically bait on a hook, but Voldemort, apparently, had taken it seriously. Really? If Dumbledore didn't have a backup plan, would he just announce the location? Then again, Voldemort was only a spectral presence right now, clinging to Quirrell's mind. Maybe the shared brain space was starting to short-circuit. He can't be serious, can he? Mikkel whispered, looking pale. Unlikely, Cedric replied, shaking his head. If Hogwarts had somewhere truly that dangerous, it would have been completely sealed off ages ago. Once the school song had been sung, Dumbledore announced it was time to head to the dormitories. But Kyle stayed put, glancing over at the Gryffindor table. After all, he was due a certain payment. Oh, that. I thought he'd forgotten, Fred and George sighed. Amid curious looks from Harry and Ron, they each popped a toffee into their mouths with a resigned expression. Wow. Oh. Laughter erupted as Fred and George's tongue stretched out to an absurd length, flapping like ribbons as they broke into an awkward, tongue-dragging tap dance around the table. This part hadn't been in the original bet, they'd added it themselves. Trying to avoid tripping over their own tongues, the twins moved in a spasmodic, almost slapstick rhythm that was oddly mesmerizing. Oh. The hall broke into another round of applause and laughter, with even Dumbledore watching them with delighted interest. Only Professor McGonagall looked less than amused, her lips pursed so tightly they almost formed a straight line. Not again, she seemed to be thinking. Wasn't 1 year enough? Now the fun in this clip is over. Which listeners haven't liked and commented yet? You can press like and comment to encourage the admin find the fun in the next clip. May the listeners be happy forever.